Late autumn 1856, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania logged a birth record for the 8th infant delivered to Miss Abigail Thornley, a woman without sight. The attending doctor scribbled troubling notes in his private ledger, though the official papers betrayed nothing strange. The Lancaster County archives held documents that sketched a deceptively ordinary picture. 8 babies delivered across 9 years to an unwed, sightless woman on a secluded homestead. To the handful of neighbors aware of the Thornley household, the situation appeared a heartbreaking case of disadvantage exploited, a disabled young woman repeatedly deceived by unscrupulous men who vanished after taking advantage. The sort of melancholy narrative that inspired sympathy during Sunday services and quiet donations of hand-me-down garments for the little ones. Yet Dr. Isaiah Merrick, who arrived for that 8th delivery on a bitter November night, found himself disturbed by observations he couldn't fully articulate. He had assisted with 3 earlier births and recognized something in the infant's appearances. A peculiar uniformity his medical education had trained him to identify. As he cleaned the newborn daughter and logged her measurements, he glanced toward the other youngsters crowded into the cramped farmhouse. 7 small faces spanning 18 months to 8 years, all displaying undeniable similarities. The physician confined his concerns to his personal diary. In that era, a doctor didn't voice suspicions lacking concrete evidence, especially regarding a respectable agricultural family. The Thornley clan had occupied the acreage for 2 generations. Silas Thornley, the aging head of household, carried a severe but decent reputation. His 4 grown sons tended the crops and attended church with suitable regularity. Still, Merrick couldn't shake what he'd witnessed. The birth intervals troubled him. The eldest child arrived when Abigail had barely turned 17. Subsequent births followed no pattern suggesting courtship or matrimony, despite Silas Thornley's shifting explanations involving itinerant peddlers and far-off admirers who pledged devotion before disappearing. Each tale satisfied the community's hunger for coherence, wrapped in the familiar tragedy of innocence betrayed. Some tragedies hide in plain sight, disguised as misfortune. What county ledgers couldn't capture, what birth certificates never revealed, was the absolute seclusion defining Abigail Thornley's existence. 3 miles separated them from the closest neighboring homestead, encircled by thick Pennsylvania forest. The Thornley land functioned as a closed world. Abigail, sightless since age 9, understood only what she could physically touch and what others described. She'd never journeyed past the property boundaries. She'd never shared conversation with another woman. Her universe comprised her father's instructions, her brother's movements, and the children she carried without glimpsing their features. That 8th certificate, filed with standard administrative efficiency, documented a beginning, but also signaled the start of an unraveling nobody present that November evening could have anticipated. Within months, circumstances would converge to expose a horror so overwhelming that officials would labor for decades attempting to rebury it. The Thornley homestead occupied terrain geography seemed to have overlooked. The land sprawled across 70 acres of unforgiving Pennsylvania soil, hemmed on 3 flanks by woodland so dense that summer sunshine scarcely penetrated undergrowth. The nearest neighboring farm belonged to the Kitterman household, a full 3 miles distant via a rutted track that became impassable during spring melts and winter squalls. This remoteness wasn't coincidental. When Silas Thornley acquired the parcel in 1832, he deliberately pursued distance from expanding settlements surrounding Lancaster. He informed the land broker he desired space for his sons to labor without interference, territory to construct a proper farming enterprise away from urban commotion and neighborhood chatter. The broker, eager to move property most deemed excessively isolated, raised no additional queries. The dwelling itself mirrored identical preferences for separation. Constructed sturdy and austere, it occupied a modest clearing devoid of ornamental touches. No front veranda for neighborly visits, no inviting flower beds. 2 stories of grey stone and dark timber featured narrow windows seemingly engineered for fortification rather than illumination. The structure faced away from the road, presenting its blank rear facade toward any traveler who might pass. Abigail had reached 9 years when scarlet fever swept Lancaster County in 1839. The sickness claimed their mother Sarah Thornley after 3 days of scorching fever and confusion. Abigail survived, though the illness ravaged the delicate mechanisms of her eyes beyond any doctor's capacity to mend. When she finally gained strength to leave her sickbed, the world had vanished into eternal blackness. Her 4 brothers, then spanning 14 to 22 years, continued cultivating the farm beside their father. Silas retreated deeper onto the property following Sarah's passing, making weekly town trips solely for critical provisions. He ceased attending religious gatherings. He declined invitations to harvest festivals and community barn construction. When neighbors inquired about his family, he supplied terse, discouraging responses that terminated discussions. For Abigail, blindness meant total reliance upon the 5 men remaining in her sphere. She mastered navigating the house through counting footsteps and memorizing furniture placement. She could assemble basic meals through tactile sense and routine. But beyond those walls, existence became an impossible labyrinth of invisible hazards and unknown perils. Her father and brothers transformed into her vision, her translators of everything beyond reach. The brothers themselves matured into taciturn, withdrawn men. The eldest, Cyrus, adopted his father's harsh demeanor and appetite for isolation. The second son, Judah, spoke infrequently and avoided direct gaze when he did. Thomas, the third brother, occasionally displayed traces of tenderness, but invariably submitted to paternal authority. Nathan, the youngest, sometimes appeared troubled by their isolated circumstances yet never expressed objections. Townspeople who occasionally encountered Thornley men found them peculiar but unthreatening. They settled debts promptly. They caused zero disturbances. They maintained self-sufficiency in ways that, while unconventional, didn't breach any social norm powerful enough to warrant intervention. Only one individual had questioned the setup. In 1844, a traveling Methodist preacher paused at the farm requesting water for his mount. He glimpsed Abigail through a window, moving tentatively through murky interiors, and asked Silas whether the young woman might benefit from a school for the blind operating in Philadelphia. Silas thanked him frigidly and recommended he continue traveling. The preacher never returned, though he documented the encounter in his diary with one unsettling observation: the girl had appeared frightened. The initial pregnancy commenced spring 1848, when Abigail turned 17. She discovered it, as women throughout ages have, through unmistakable bodily transformations no amount of darkness could mask. When she informed her father, he remained wordless for an extended moment before requesting she explain how this occurred. Abigail, bewildered by the question, stated she didn't understand. She couldn't see who entered and departed the house. She heard male voices, sometimes unrecognizable as her father or brothers, assuming they were laborers hired for planting or reaping. Silas listened to her halting explanation, then delivered something that would frame the next 9 years of her existence. A merchant had been visiting the farm, he claimed, a textile dealer from Philadelphia bringing supplies unavailable in Lancaster. This man had expressed interest in Abigail, spoken gently, promised courtship with honorable aims. Silas confessed he'd permitted private conversations with his daughter, believing intentions genuine. Now the merchant had evaporated, pledges exposed as fabrications designed to exploit a vulnerable woman's faith. The narrative satisfied every tragedy expectation that period understood. Innocent maidens ruined by deceitful suitors represented familiar storytelling, one generating compassion rather than doubt. When Silas made his subsequent town journey, he shared the sorrowful news with the general store owner, who circulated it throughout the community with suitable expressions of pity. Poor blind Abigail Thornley, manipulated by a smooth-talking drifter. The family would shoulder disgrace privately, as respectable folk did. Abigail herself wrestled reconciling her father's version with fragmented recollections. She recalled moments of disorientation, being instructed to remain silent in her chamber while business transpired, waking sometimes sensing time had elapsed in ways she couldn't monitor. But blindness had taught her distrusting her own awareness. She'd learned accepting explanations from those who could verify reality in methods forever denied her. Blindness taught her to doubt even her own truth. The pregnancy advanced through summer into fall. Abigail's brothers grew even quieter around her, speaking solely when essential. She heard them laboring outdoors, heard their boots on wooden planks, heard their subdued voices conversing with their father. But they no longer sat beside her during meals, no longer assisted with minor household tasks as they once had. The shift troubled her, though she couldn't articulate why. When labor initiated on a February night in 1849, only her father attended. He delivered livestock on the farm and approached the birth with identical practical efficiency. The child, a boy, arrived healthy and wailing. Silas positioned the infant in Abigail's arms and informed her the baby possessed his father's dark hair, though she could never corroborate this claim. She named him Samuel after her mother's father. She nursed him and tended him with fierce dedication, discovering purpose in motherhood her constrained world hadn't otherwise supplied. The baby became her existence's center, the solitary thing she could physically know completely. What Abigail couldn't recognize was that Samuel's features bore zero resemblance to any Philadelphia merchant. The infant's face, had she possessed sight, would have revealed unmistakable characteristics of Thornley lineage, particularly the distinctive eye shape and jawline marking all Silas's sons. The second pregnancy arrived 15 months following Samuel's birth. Abigail experienced familiar nausea and exhaustion with mingled apprehension and resignation. When she notified her father, his explanation materialized more swiftly this time. A farmhand employed for harvest season, he stated. A young man from Virginia who'd worked fields through October and spoken kindly during meals. Another marriage promise, another vanishing when work concluded and weather chilled. She delivered a daughter June 1851. Then another son March 1853. Each pregnancy announced itself with identical biological certainty, and each time Silas furnished a fresh story. A horse trader passing through, a distant cousin visiting from Ohio, a carpenter hired repairing the barn. The phantom men varied in descriptions, but the pattern remained identical: brief presence, false vows, inevitable abandonment. By the fourth pregnancy, Abigail ceased inquiring. She'd learned her questions led nowhere, that confusion only seemed disappointing her father. She focused instead on children, filling her days with tangible purpose. She could distinguish each infant by touch, by their particular cry patterns, by weight in her arms. They became her world in ways nothing else could. Community response evolved from sympathy toward quiet judgment. Women in town whispered regarding poor decisions and inadequate supervision. Some suggested perhaps Abigail's blindness rendered her incapable discerning men's character, that her disability extended beyond sight into inability protecting herself. Others wondered aloud why Silas Thornley didn't guard his daughter more vigilantly, though they rapidly retreated from criticism when confronted with difficulties controlling adult behavior. Dr. Merrick began attending births following the fifth child, The previous physician had aged beyond travel to remote properties, and Merrick had recently launched his Lancaster practice. His Philadelphia medical training exposed him to diagnostic methods rural practitioners often missed. He noticed details troubling him yet couldn't voice without proof. The children's ages formed a timeline raising questions. 8 children across 9 years meant Abigail had remained pregnant or nursing nearly her complete adult existence. Physical toll showed in her thinning frame and perpetual exhaustion. But more disturbing to Merrick were similarities he observed among children. Medical science grasped inheritance, understood trait transmission from parents to offspring. Feature consistency across children supposedly fathered by different men defied probability. He also noted something else during visits. Brothers never regarded their sister when he was present. They avoided the chamber where she labored. They displayed zero curiosity about children, no avuncular affection expected toward nephews and nieces. Their behavior suggested not distance but something approaching shame. The 8th pregnancy, bringing Merrick to the farm that November evening 1856, unfolded in an atmosphere of mounting tension. Silas Thornley had grown frailer, authority sustained more through habit than vigor. Brothers moved through the house like men bearing unbearable weight, and Abigail, now 26, seemed retreated into protective silence, speaking solely when necessary, existing in space between acceptance and despair. None realized this birth would be final, that events were already advancing that would dismantle carefully constructed fabrications sustaining the household nearly a decade. Silas Thornley collapsed in the barn on a frozen morning, January 1857. Cyrus discovered him crumpled against a feed trough, conscious yet struggling breathing. By evening, pneumonia had settled into his lungs with swift brutality common to men past 60 laboring in winter cold. Merrick arrived too late, offering anything beyond comfort care and grim forecast. The old man lasted 3 days. During final hours, delirious with fever, he spoke in fragmented sentences, making his sons exchange worried glances. He mentioned Philadelphia, though he'd never traveled there. He spoke about preserving secrets and protecting family name. Most disturbing, he called for Sarah, his deceased wife, begging forgiveness for things he wouldn't specify. Abigail sat beside his deathbed, holding his hand, unaware of panic spreading through her brothers. She heard their urgent whispers yet couldn't decipher words. She sensed room tension like physical presence but attributed it to grief. When Silas finally ceased breathing, she mourned the man who'd been her sole world interpreter. Never comprehending his death had just removed her exploitation's architect. The immediate problem was practical. Silas had managed all financial matters, legal affairs, interactions with authorities and institutions. His sons could cultivate land, but none had handled contracts, paid taxes, or maintained records proving ownership. The farm existed in legal gray area. Silas's personal authority had previously resolved through sheer presence force. Pennsylvania law mandated estates be settled through proper channels. Death notice filed with county clerk triggered automatic review when minor children were involved. 8 children residing on remote farm with unmarried blind mother and 4 bachelor uncles represented precisely the situation demanding official oversight. The county appointed Edmund Fairchild as guardian ad litem 6 weeks following Silas's burial. Fairchild was 38, Princeton educated, and possessed the methodical mind of someone trusting documents over explanations. He'd handled dozens of state cases, most involving widows and orphans requiring temporary state protection until inheritances could be properly distributed. He arrived at Thornley Farm on a March afternoon when spring mud made the journey arduous. Brothers met him in the yard, discomfort obvious even before he began questioning. Cyrus handled most talking, explaining in carefully neutral terms their father had managed everything, that they were simple farmers unaccustomed to legal matters, hoping to maintain household without disruption. Fairchild nodded and recorded notes. He requested financial records, property deeds, birth certificates for children. Brothers produced a wooden box containing scattered papers, some official, many simply personal notes in Silas's cramped handwriting. Disorganization alone raised flags. Men maintaining property this long usually kept better documentation. Then Fairchild asked, speaking with Abigail. Brothers hesitated, exchanging looks the attorney found revealing. When they finally led him inside, he encountered a pale, thin woman navigating the house with careful precision of someone moving through familiar darkness. She answered questions politely yet offered minimal information beyond confirming her name and her children's names. What struck Fairchild most powerfully wasn't what she stated but what she didn't know. She couldn't tell him when her father purchased property. She possessed zero awareness of debts or assets. She knew nothing regarding her children's legal status. Most troubling, when he asked about fathers, her answers matched none of the stories brothers had just provided in the yard. Edmund Fairchild spent 3 hours interviewing each brother separately in days following his initial visit. He employed a technique learned from criminal prosecutors, asking identical questions in different ways, noting where stories aligned and where they diverged. Inconsistencies emerged immediately. Cyrus claimed the first child's father had been a merchant from Philadelphia visiting twice in 1848. Judah insisted a traveling salesman from Baltimore who came through only once. Thomas mentioned a fabric trader but placed time frame in 1847, before Abigail's pregnancy actually began. Nathan, visibly uncomfortable throughout interview, could recall zero details about the supposed merchant. The second child's paternity generated even more contradictory accounts. A farmhand from Virginia per Cyrus, a drifter from Kentucky per Judah's version. Thomas called him a hired carpenter. Nathan again claimed ignorance. None of the brothers could supply surnames for any men. No one could describe specific conversations or interactions beyond vague references to harvest work and casual courtship. Fairchild asked why nobody had pursued these men for child support, a legal right even for unmarried mothers in Pennsylvania. Brothers offered various explanations about not knowing men's true destinations, about avoiding scandal, about their father preferring handling matters privately. Each reason sounded plausible in isolation, but collectively revealed defensive posture rather than genuine explanation. The attorney then did something brothers didn't expect. He traveled to Lancaster and spent 2 days reviewing old newspapers and talking to merchants who might remember transactions with Thornley Farm. The general store proprietor recalled Silas Thornley coming to town regularly but always alone. The feed supplier confirmed identical pattern. A livery stable owner, who tracked such details for business purposes, stated flatly he'd never witnessed anyone except Silas and occasionally one son visit from that property. More damning, Fairchild located the Methodist minister who'd stopped at the farm in 1844. Reverend Marcus Wheaton, now serving a congregation in Harrisburg, remembered the encounter vividly. He described a household feeling wrong in ways he couldn't articulate at the time. The girl had seemed afraid. The father had been hostile toward any suggestion of outside contact. The whole property had emanated a sense of something concealed. Armed with this information, Fairchild returned to the farm and presented brothers with his findings. He didn't accuse them directly but laid out contradictions methodically. Different stories about identical events. 0 corroborating witnesses to any visiting men. No financial records of hiring workers during periods when these supposed farmhands would have been present. Birth timelines suggesting either remarkable coincidence or something far darker. Cyrus attempted maintaining the fiction, insisting their memories simply differed about minor details. But Nathan broke first, not with confession but with visible distress. He left the room abruptly, and Fairchild heard him retching outside. Judah stared at his hands with expression mixing shame and resignation. Thomas began crying silently, shoulders shaking. Fairchild made a decision that would alter investigation's course. He informed brothers he was requesting medical examination of all children, ostensibly to assess their health for guardianship purposes. In reality, he wanted Dr. Merrick's professional opinion about something his legal training couldn't definitively prove, but his instinct screamed was accurate. The children bore family resemblance, suggesting biological impossibility unless the unthinkable had occurred. Dr. Isaiah Merrick arrived at Thornley Farm on a morning in late April, carrying his medical bag and leather journal for documentation. Fairchild had explained his concerns in carefully chosen words, but the physician needed 0 hints. His own observations during previous births had already planted seeds of terrible suspicion. He examined each child methodically, recording heights, weights, general health markers, detailed physical descriptions. The 8 children ranged from Samuel, now 8 years, down to the infant girl born previous November. They were reasonably healthy despite limited diets and isolation marking their existence. But health wasn't what troubled Merrick. Facial structure showed consistency defying statistical probability. All 8 children shared the distinctive Thornley jawline, pronounced and square. Eye shape, set slightly deeper than average, appeared in every face. Ears, unusually small and close to skull, marked each child. Even hair growth pattern at temples followed identical lines. Merrick had studied heredity at medical school, had read emerging theories about trait transmission from parents to offspring. Individual features could coincide by chance, but comprehensive similarity across 8 children supposedly fathered by different men represented medical impossibility. The sole explanation fitting evidence was that these children shared paternity, or at minimum came from severely limited gene pool. He asked brothers to sit for comparison. They complied reluctantly, aware cooperation was expected yet dreading what the physician might conclude. Merrick examined their features with clinical detachment, noting measurements and characteristics in his journal. Resemblance between adult men and children was unmistakable. Samuel could have been younger Cyrus. The second son shared Judah's distinctive nose. Pattern continued through all 8 children. The doctor then did something pushing beyond standard medical practice into uncomfortable territory. He asked about birth defects, developmental delays, any signs of physical problems sometimes appearing in children born of close blood relations. Pennsylvania physicians in 1857 understood, though perhaps incompletely, that reproduction between relatives increased certain risks. 6 of 8 children showed no obvious defects, but the 4th child, a boy of 4 years, struggled with speech in ways suggesting developmental complications. The 6th child, a girl of 2 years, had been slow walking and showed hand tremors that worried Merrick. These weren't definitive proof of anything but added weight to already overwhelming evidence body. Merrick completed his examination and spoke with Fairchild privately. He explained his findings in medical terms, then in plain language, leaving 0 room for misunderstanding. The children were almost certainly fathered by men sharing close genetic relation to Abigail. Given household isolation and absence of any documented visitors, the conclusion became inescapable. The 4 brothers, or some combination thereof, had fathered their sister's children. Fairchild absorbed this information with grim expression of a man whose worst suspicions had been confirmed. He asked Merrick to prepare formal medical report documenting everything in language that could withstand legal scrutiny. The physician agreed, understanding they were moving beyond estate guardianship into criminal investigation. The The question now wasn't what happened, but how to prove it, and more agonizingly, what to tell Abigail. She remained in the house caring for her children, unaware the men she trusted as protectors were being identified as her violators. The truth would destroy her understanding of her entire adult life. Edmund Fairchild made tactical decision to separate brothers completely. He arranged for county sheriff to bring them to Lancaster one at a time for formal questioning, ensuring they couldn't coordinate responses. Nathan, the youngest at 28, was brought in first. Fairchild had observed during earlier interviews that Nathan carried his guilt most visibly. The interrogation room in Lancaster Courthouse was sparse and uncomfortable by design. Nathan sat across a wooden table from Fairchild and Sheriff William Ducker, his hands trembling as he gripped the chair. The attorney began not with accusations but with simple statement of medical fact. The children showed genetic markers consistent with close familial relation to their uncles. Nathan said nothing for a long moment, then he asked in voice barely above whisper, what would happen to Abigail if he told the truth? Fairchild couldn't answer that question honestly without lying. So he said only that truth was emerging regardless and cooperation would be noted by court. The confession began haltingly. Nathan explained their mother's death had changed their father in ways transcending grief. Silas became obsessed with keeping family together, with maintaining Thornley bloodline on property, with ensuring no outsiders could ever claim authority over his children. When Abigail lost her sight, his obsession found its terrible focus. Silas had devised the arrangement deliberately. He told his sons their sister needed protection, that the world would exploit her vulnerability, that only family could be trusted. He framed the abuse as duty, as sacrifice for preservation of their lineage. He began with Cyrus when Abigail was 17, orchestrating encounters in her room while she believed a visiting merchant was courting her. Her blindness made deception possible. Nathan's testimony, recorded by clerk in careful script, detailed 9 years of systematic violation. Each brother had participated, though Nathan insisted he'd done so only twice and under extreme pressure from their father. Silas had supervised the entire operation, providing cover stories, managing timing to prevent suspicion, threatening his sons with disinheritance and exposure if they refused or revealed truth. The youngest brother described how Abigail was kept deliberately ignorant. She was told strange men visited the farm when in fact it was her own brothers entering her room. She was prevented from developing any relationships outside household that might expose lies. She was taught doubting her own perceptions, accepting that her blindness rendered her unreliable in understanding what happened around her. Nathan broke down completely when describing his last participation 2 years earlier. He'd attempted refusing, told his father the entire arrangement was evil and had to stop. Silas had responded with cold fury, reminding Nathan he was already complicit, already guilty, and that refusing now would accomplish nothing except his own destruction. The old man had threatened, testifying that Nathan alone was responsible for all children if he didn't comply. Fairchild pressed for specific details about other brothers' involvement. Cyrus had fathered at least 3 children. Judah had fathered 2. Thomas had participated, but Nathan was uncertain about resulting pregnancies. Exact parentage of some children remained unclear, lost in fog of repeated violations over nearly a decade. The confession took 4 hours. When it concluded, Nathan asked again what would happen to Abigail. Fairchild told him honestly he didn't know, but that she would need protection from her brothers immediately. Nathan nodded and said he understood, then asked being taken to a cell before his brothers learned he'd spoken. Arrests happened swiftly. Sheriff Ducker and 3 deputies arrived at Thornley Farm before dawn, taking Cyrus, Judah, and Thomas into custody without incident. Brothers were transported to separate county jails to prevent any coordination or violence. By noon, Abigail found herself alone with her 8 children in a house that had never felt more silent. She knew something catastrophic had occurred but couldn't comprehend its nature. A deputy had told her only that legal matters required her brother's presence in Lancaster, that arrangements would be made for her care. She heard wagons arriving throughout the day, heard unfamiliar voices discussing logistics. Women from charitable society came to inventory household and assess children's needs. Their kindness felt ominous. Edmund Fairchild faced moral dilemma that law school had never prepared him for. He possessed documentation of sustained criminal abuse, confessions from perpetrators, medical evidence supporting charges. Brothers would face prosecution. But what about their victim, who remained unaware she'd been victimized? He convened meeting with Dr. Merrick and Reverend Samuel Blackburn, a Lutheran minister known for thoughtful approach to difficult pastoral situations. The 3 men gathered in Fairchild's office and debated question that had no satisfying answer. Should Abigail be told the truth about her children's parentage? Merrick argued from medical necessity. She would need ongoing care, would eventually encounter situations where truth might emerge through other channels. Better controlling revelation than having her discover it accidentally through courthouse gossip or careless remarks. Shock would be severe regardless, but at least carefully managed disclosure could provide immediate support. Reverend Blackburn countered with equal conviction. What purpose would truth serve except destroying whatever peace Abigail had constructed in her limited world? She believed herself unfortunate woman repeatedly abandoned by faithless suitors. While tragic, this understanding allowed her maintaining dignity and identity as mother. Revealing her own brothers had violated her would shatter that foundation without offering anything redemptive in return. Fairchild listened to both positions, then raised complicating factor. Abigail would ask questions. She'd want knowing why her brothers had been arrested, why she was being removed from farm, what had prompted sudden intervention. Any explanation avoiding truth would require elaborate deception, creating new framework of lies replacing the old one. Discussion continued for hours, with each man acknowledging the choice's impossible nature. Finally, they reached consensus based not on what was right but what was least harmful. They would tell Abigail that legal complications regarding estate required her brother's detention. They would move her and children to Lancaster, where charitable families could provide proper housing and support. They would observe her carefully, and if she pressed for more information, they would provide it incrementally with medical and pastoral care immediately available. But they wouldn't volunteer truth. They wouldn't destroy her understanding of her own life unless forced by circumstances beyond their control. 2 days later, Fairchild traveled to farm with a woman named Margaret Holloway, who ran boarding house in Lancaster known for discretion and compassion. They found Abigail sitting in kitchen holding her youngest child, surrounded by others who sensed their mother's confusion and fear. Fairchild delivered carefully constructed explanation, estate complications, legal necessities, temporary arrangements for her protection and comfort. He used language designed to obscure rather than illuminate, hating himself for deception even as he judged it necessary. Abigail listened quietly, then asked a single question that nearly broke his resolve. She wanted knowing if her brothers were safe, if they'd be coming home soon. Fairchild told her he couldn't say, which was true enough. She accepted this non-answer with resigned acceptance of someone accustomed to incomplete information. The trial of Thornley brothers occurred behind closed doors in August 1857. Pennsylvania law permitted sealed proceedings in cases involving sexual crimes, particularly when victims required protection from public exposure. Judge, prosecutors, and defense attorneys agreed public knowledge would serve no purpose except inflicting additional suffering on Abigail and her children. Nathan's confession formed prosecution case's core. Medical testimony from Dr. Merrick provided corroboration no jury could dismiss. Brothers mounted no serious defense. Cyrus remained silent throughout proceedings. Judah offered only statement that their father had orchestrated everything, which was true but legally irrelevant to their own culpability. Thomas wept openly but provided no testimony. Sentences reflected the era's limited understanding of such crimes. Cyrus received 15 years in Eastern State Penitentiary. Judah received 12 years. Thomas received 10 years. Nathan, whose cooperation had been instrumental in prosecution, received 7 years. All 4 were prohibited from any contact with their sister or children upon release. The judge's final statement, preserved in sealed court records, described the cases among most disturbing he'd encountered in 3 decades on bench. Children presented more complex problem. 8 young lives connected by biological relationships too tangled to explain. Fairchild worked with charitable organizations to place them in separate families across Lancaster, Chester, and York counties. Adoptive families were told only that children came from difficult household situation requiring discretion. No mention was made of their true parentage or birth circumstances. Samuel, eldest at 8 years, went to farming family in York. Others dispersed to merchants, tradesmen, and one school teacher who'd lost her own child to illness. Placements were chosen carefully to prevent siblings from encountering each other accidentally as they grew. The goal was giving each child fresh start, unburdened by knowledge of their origins. Abigail was brought to live with Margaret Holloway permanently. The boarding house became her home for next 14 years. She never learned what had been done to her. She believed until her death in 1871 at age 40 that she'd been courted and abandoned by multiple men, that her brothers had been imprisoned for some unspecified legal matter, and that her children had been placed in good homes because she couldn't care for them alone. Margaret Holloway, who cared for Abigail with genuine affection, occasionally heard her speak about hoping to see her brothers again someday. The blind woman never understood why this reunion never occurred, why letters she dictated received no response, why men who'd been her protectors and guides had vanished so completely from her life. Court records remained sealed until 1898, when legal scholar researching 19th-century criminal proceedings discovered them in county archives. His published article treated case with appropriate clinical distance, changing names but preserving essential facts. Article generated brief academic interest, then faded into vast collection of historical horrors each generation uncovers and struggles comprehending. Thornley Farm was sold at auction. Proceeds went into trust for children's benefit, administered by Fairchild until his own death in 1876. By then, the 8 children had grown into adults scattered across Pennsylvania, none knowing their siblings, none aware of their true origins. Some married and had children of their own, passing on genetic markers they could never have explained. This case stands as testament to how isolation enables abuse, how vulnerability invites exploitation, and how some truths are considered too devastating to speak aloud. Abigail Thornley spent her entire adult life in darkness, both literal and imposed. Men who should have protected her instead ensured she would never see truth about her own existence. The cruelest prison is one where the captive never sees the bars. The greatest tragedy may be that silence maintained around her was judged an act of mercy. If this story has affected you, if it's made you think about hidden histories existing in sealed court records and forgotten archives, then click that like button and subscribe to Wens of Thought. These stories need telling, not for shock value. but because understanding darkest corners of human behavior is how we learn recognizing and preventing it in our own time. Your support allows us continuing this difficult but necessary work of bringing light to what was meant staying hidden.